This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken, for the warm introduction, and thank you for the sponsors for also putting this event on, and also for everybody who's attended today. I'm particularly grateful given it's such a beautiful evening outside there. As Ken suggested, what I'm really going to be talking about today is the concept of the best and how experts are made. A lot of the examples we'll probably pull from sport, given as Ken suggested, I also have a background in sport and exercise science, but I think certainly I will use examples from other domains, and certainly the principles and concepts that apply to sport will transfer across domains. So I guess bear that in mind when we go through and consider what implications this might have in other professional domains, and even, I guess, in your daily life as you move through our lifetime. The lecture is actually based on, whilst Ken said I have written 18 books, and that's true, this is my first ever popular science book, and it came out 18 months ago. The white copy is the hardback, the black version is the paperback. I actually wrote it with a journalist, Tim Wigmore, who works for the Daily Telegraph in the UK. And it kind of synthesizes the science with a lot of autobiographical information. So we actually had access to around 100 of the top athletes in the world. And we were able to, pull the science and this biographical information together. So the book is actually split into three parts. The first part talks about environment and the role of serendipity in the development of expertise. So the first rule to become an expert is be born lucky, and I'll explain why in a minute. The middle part of the book talks about some of the adaptations that occur as a result of prolonged engagement in different domains, with a particular focus on the development of game intelligence skills, such as perception and decision making. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the implications for learning and practice and some of the key environmental factors that contribute to the development of expertise. So let's come back first and foremost then to this concept of being born lucky. There is now a fairly substantive body of research evidence that highlights some of the key environmental factors that are important in the development of expertise. We know that family and significant others, such as mentors and guardians, are important in regards to introducing children to sport or to any particular activity early in development. We also know that socioeconomic background has a factor, and this obviously determines, for instance, the kinds of sports that you may be interested in. Sports like soccer and basketball, a lot of athletes come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, whereas obviously other sports like skiing, golf and tennis, then typically the socioeconomic backgrounds are slightly higher. There's also work to suggest actually that statistically you are much more likely to be an elite athlete if you have siblings, and particularly older siblings, 1.2 times more likely to be an elite athlete actually. And the argument for this is by having older siblings, they introduce you to the sport earlier. They provide an opportunity to provide information and knowledge about the sport. They obviously also provide some form of competition. They're stressing the younger child to strive and to do better. So I said having a sibling at all is beneficial, but certainly if you're the younger sibling, then your chances of being an elite performer are considerably higher. Place of birth also has a key component, in so much as it gives you access to coaches, to high-level competition, to teammates that are of a similar ability, to facilities, and to so-called communities of learning. And there are pockets of expertise all around the globe. For instance, your chances of being an alpine skier are clearly much higher if you're born in the Alps, or you're born in Colorado or in Utah, to what they might be in Florida. And your chances of probably being an elite soccer player are higher if you're born in the inner cities of Liverpool, Manchester and London, or the streets of Paris. So where we're born has a considerable determining factor on our access and our opportunities to factors that are important in the development of expertise. Another crucial factor is our month of birth. And I guess probably most of us didn't realize that the timing of our parents' nocturnal activity has such a dramatic effect on our chances of becoming an elite performer. For instance, these are data from over 6,000 Premier League academy players, soccer players in England. And the selection year in England runs from September through till August. And as you can see here, nearly 50% of the players who are selected for these elite training academies are born in the first quarter of the selection year. And only around 12% come from the final quarter. And these kinds of effects have actually been shown across a myriad of sports and also in academia, where children born in August have roughly 10 to 12% lower academic performance scores than those born in September, even though in principle they may be in the same academic year. The reasons for this, principally in sport, of course, is that those born earlier in the selection year are likely to have some advantages, certainly in regards to physical size. So they're likely to be the bigger and the stronger. Also at young ages, of course, the difference between being born in month 1 and month 12 is a considerable advantage in regards to emotional development, cognitive development, and practice in the sport. Which all makes it very, very difficult, therefore, if you're born later in the selection year. There are some sports where actually we get the reverse effects. So gymnastics, for instance, and ballet, it's an advantage to be small. So therefore, the vast majority of athletes are born in the final quarter of the selection year. These are data that we gathered around a decade or so ago from the French National School for Soccer, just outside of Paris. And in fact, many of these players were part of the French World Cup winning team in 1998. The top graph here highlights the proportion of players born in each quarter of the selection year. And as you can see here, less than 10% of players are born in that final quarter. There is a slight paradox here, though, and it's something that's called the underdog effect. The bottom graph here highlights the proportion of players from each quarter that actually progress to professional level. And as you see, whilst your chances of being selected into an elite training academy are much higher if you're born early in the selection year, your chances of actually progressing to full-time professional status are better if you're born later in the year. The argument here potentially is that if you do not have the advantages of physical size early in development, then you have to focus on developing other skills like technical and tactical skill or key psychological skills that will obviously ensure that you remain competitive and stay in the game, so that when the physical disadvantages tend to disappear at puberty, then you have got those skills to fall back on. Interestingly, we also differentiate between chronological age, which is determined by your month of birth, and biological age, which is your rate of maturity relative to your chronological age. And what we also did with these players in the top graph here is we had access to all their physical and physiological performance data. And surprisingly, there were very few differences between the players born in the first and the fourth quarter. So what this means actually that even though the players born in the fourth quarter had a chronological disadvantage, they did not have a biological disadvantage. So imagine if you're born late in the year and you're biologically average in terms of your development or below average, then your chances of progression are indeed very, very small indeed. Coming back to this underdog effect, though, we also collected some data where we looked at all those players who'd been selected for key awards like the Ballon d'Or, the World Football or Soccer Player of the Year. But also, we also looked at the most valuable player in the NBA, the National Hockey League, and the NFL. And surprisingly, we didn't get, again, a relative age effect in this particular sample, which tends to suggest that expertise seems to be able to mediate this relative age bias. Two interesting sports for me from American perspective. Firstly, in the National Hockey League, salary is negatively correlated with the month of birth. So in other words, the later you're born in the selection year, the higher your salary. It's very high, the correlation. And again, this might be something to do with the fact that those players born later are more creative. The only American sport that doesn't have a strong relative age effect actually is American football, surprisingly perhaps. And that is mainly because selection programs don't come in until about the age of 14, so they're post-puberty. Whereas in soccer, for instance, these selection programs occur as early as 5 and 6 years of age. I just thought I'd throw this picture there, actually, which is a very nice illustration. This is a soccer player, as you might gather. He was born late in the selection year, also had some growth deficiencies during development, but has subsequently prospered. I'll give you a clue, as you might guess who it is. That's his father there in the top left-hand corner. I think he looks a little bit like him now, possibly. Anybody want to hazard a guess? I think Ken offered $10 to anybody who get it correct. It's Lionel Messi, yeah. So look how small he is compared to that player. Interestingly, I've just come back actually last night from Austria. I was at Red Bull Salzburg Training Academy, and two players went past me. They were both 15 years of age. One was about 6'2", and the other was about 5'2". It was just incredible, the difference between them in size. Okay, some other key environmental factors. You know, there's a huge debate around specialization and diversification. I don't know whether some of you have read this book. It's quite a bestseller, actually. Dave Epstein, he actually wrote the book Sporting Genes. And then this is his latest book, Range, in which he argues that generalist triumphs in a specialized world. So he's arguing a lot for the fact that there is transferability of skill. The scientific evidence on this is actually quite scant. Even though there might be a lot of intuitive and anecdotal evidence to suggest that skills transfer, there is hardly any scientific evidence to suggest what transfers, what amount of exposure to other sports is actually needed or not. Whereas in contrast, there is a huge amount of research evidence that supports the importance of specificity in the development of expertise. There's a lot of data that has been gathered looking back retrospectively at the developmental history profiles of elite performers from a range of different domains, including music, even academia, Nobel Prize winners, and across a range of different sports. And of course, some of you will have notionally heard about the 10,000-hour rule, and it was proposed by Malcolm Gladwell in his best-selling book Outliers as a rule, but it was it wasn't a rule, and the 10,000 hours was actually put forward by a very famous cognitive psychologist who was at Florida State University for years called Anders Ericsson. And what Anders actually suggested was that performance was very well correlated with the amount of hours accumulated in practice. And it did so happen that this 10,000 hours came up quite often, but it's not a rule. I think it's merely a guideline. And of course, the actual number of hours that are needed to become an expert in whatever domain are probably domain specific. And it largely depends on the extent to which early specialization is the norm in those sports, and maybe to the extent to which those sports and activities are based on technical, tactical, psychological skills as opposed to physical and physiological attributes. Here was the original data that Ericsson and colleagues gathered actually with violinists at a music academy in Munich. And what they did is they used questionnaires, training diaries, and retrospective interviews to look back historically at the developmental history profiles of these athletes. So what you have on the vertical axis here is the hours accumulated in practice, and then we have the age of the musicians along the bottom. We have professional violinists, best experts, good experts, least accomplished experts, and amateur pianists. So clearly, do note the very strong linear relationship between hours accumulated in practice and level of achievement. And of course, if you look at the professional violinists there, by age 20 and draw a line across, you are around that 10,000 hour mark. More recently, a lot of the sports have been pushing towards earlier and earlier specialization into the sport. And there are some potential disadvantages, of course, with specialization, notably the potential risk of burnout and overuse injuries. But at the same time, the challenge is if you don't at least engage early, if not necessarily specialize early, then you may end up with a practice deficit, which you may not be able to make up relative to other competitors. Early engagement suggests that you begin to participate in the sport early, but you can still participate in other sports, but you accumulate an appropriate amount of hours to allow you to be competitive. Specialization is you might, in principle, participate in a wide variety of sports during development. Specialization is you participate in one sport and one sport only during development. Diversification is you specialize in a wide variety of sports during development or participate in them. These are data that we gathered actually a few years back from elite Premier League academy players at the age of 16. And what you can see here is that the elite Premier League academy players have accumulated around 7,000 hours of practice by age 16. Whereas the sub-elite players here represented their schools, some of them played regional soccer, and they probably accumulated just over 4,000 hours of practice. So again, that's a big difference in practice to make up in a sport that is heavily dependent on technical and tactical ability. So if you have an aspiring 5-6-year-old boy, and more recently girls, because now the academy system, which has been in place for the male teams, is now being replicated with the female players. Typically, you have to begin participating in the sport around the age of 4, be in formal structured training by age 6, typically join an academy by age 8, invest 9 to 10 years of your life to the sport, accumulating 800 hours per year in practice, 16 hours per week, roughly split up into 4 hours team practice, 5 hours individual practice, and 7 hours in informal play, 7,500 hours. It's a huge investment. And of course, less than 0.1% of players who set off on that path make the professional level. But there are very few, if any, players now who come into the system late. I think 30, 40 years ago, that could happen. But now that the game has become a lot more systematic and this huge investment of hours is taking place, it's very hard unless you at least engage early. Okay. These are just sample data that we also gathered from England, France, Sweden, Portugal, all professional players. They all have a similar pathway. Engagement around 4, formal academies age 6. Much of the initial early engagement is through play-related activity, street football, street soccer, but increasing amounts of coach-led practice and increasing amounts of match play through onwards to 18 years of age. These are data actually from international women's teams. These include data from the US World Cup winning team from the last games, as well as from Brazil, Canada, England, Sweden. So some of the best women's players in the world. And what you can see here is a very similar path, as I suggested earlier, that is now developing for the female players compared to the male players. Most of the English Premier League teams now also have women's academies that mirror those of the men's. The only slight difference is the fact that the overall hours accumulated is slightly less at the moment, maybe around 10 to 20% less. But as I said, that's because the systemization of the women's sport is still fairly recent. I'm sure in 10 years' time the data will be quite comparable. Interesting question around the importance of play versus practice. There is some evidence to suggest that free play-related activity is very important in regards to the development of creativity. So for instance, elite performers who show higher levels of game intelligence, in other words, they're better at anticipating, better at decision making, have accumulated more hours in street play-related activity during development than their less skilled counterparts. Now, the question is, of course, whether the fact that they're engaging in play activity is the determining factor, or the fact that there is a problem with some of the over-structured nature of the coaching process, which may also be the case. But certainly these are the kinds of play environments that you no longer see. In contrast, these are probably things that you see more now. So, you can walk around the streets of any inner cities in the UK and you'll quite often see the sign, no ball games within this area. So kids, don't participate in street sport because of that issue now. Equally, or perhaps even more so, PlayStation and other multimedia sources of entertainment have taken over from participation in sport. And of course, with perhaps increased risks over safety and the growing trend towards helicopter parenting, you end up quite frequently with empty courts of this nature. So how about talent identification and selection then? Talent identification is an extremely difficult process. But of course, if you have several thousand kids who want to join an academy at 6, 7, 8 years of age, how do you select 100 of those players to progress into the academy structure? And whilst in essence much of the decision is somewhat intuitive and subjective, increasingly scientists have begun to look at whether there are any defining characteristics that would allow us to make some kind of scientific judgment. So scientists usually record data on physiological characteristics, sociological predictors, psychological predictors, a whole range of different factors. But there are a number of problems here, not least in sports like basketball, tennis, and soccer, where physicality perhaps is not the dominant factor. Perhaps in sports like rowing, long-distance running, cycling, where endurance and power, and sports where height are important, the NBA, for instance, you probably have to be a certain height to compete at the highest level, then some of these physical and physiological predictors are probably quite important. But in sports which are more determined by technical, tactical, and psychological things, then it's very hard to identify predictive factors. This chart was given to me by the fitness and conditioning coach at Manchester United a few years ago. And it's actually what's called a Butler performance profile. So what we have here on the outside of the circle is a range of different characteristics that the club measured. Apologies if you can't see it very well, but they're things like leg strength, upper body strength, body composition, a range of different factors. And the closer you are to the blue circle on the outside, the better performance is. So I think as a way of identifying strengths and weaknesses, is a very useful tool. So you can see for this player, for instance, upper body strength is around 10 o'clock, and he's in the yellow, which is not so good. Whereas body composition up at 11 o'clock is in the blue. So that's quite good. However, the interesting question, if you put one of these charts on the wall for each of the 30-odd professional players at Manchester United, to what extent would they be the same? And to what extent would they be different? And I guess the interesting question, are there minimum competencies that are needed on any of these factors? Or does something that I've referred to as the compensation phenomenon apply, in the sense that if you have a weakness in one area, for instance, you may not be quick over 5 or 10 yards, that you can compensate for that by developing better technical skills or game intelligence skills. So it becomes very hard to deselect players based on these measures. If you look around the screen as well, and this was a fitness and conditioning coach, there are very few attributes that comment on psychological components, technical or tactical. So if you put all those components in, just think how many slices you would have to this circle and how many potential points of variance you would have. And this is the challenge, therefore, in any aspect of talent identification. What we really don't have actually is longitudinal research work, where what we might do is test players at group under 8, and then some of those players will progress into the target pool at under 10. Some will obviously be deselected from the academy or will drop out, and likewise through to under 12 and under 14, right the way through to under 16. Then I guess it would give us an indication of what the predictive utility of each of these measures might be at different stages of development. But no such data of high quality currently exists. The other thing to note, of course, is that the factors that may discriminate players early on may not be the factors that discriminate players later on. So you may find that the things that determine why players progress from under 8 to under 10s are the physical attributes. And then the things that decide who progresses from under 16 to under 18 are psychological or technical tactical. So then you may end up deselecting players for measures that are not the determining factor of expertise later in development. So talent identification, talent search is difficult. There doesn't seem to be a single gene or a measurable factor that accounts for a large enough proportion of the variance. The key factors that the human system adapts to training, motivation, mental toughness, and resilience are key. So what I've tried to do there is just to highlight the fact that, there is a huge amount of serendipity, a huge amount of luck in why we become an elite athlete, or even why we become expert across a range of different domains, not many of which we have any external control over. The things that we do have control over, of course, is our capacity to engage in systematic practice in order to develop some of the key skills. And one of the things that the human system demonstrates is considerable plasticity and adaptability in the development of expertise. So there's a very Darwinian notion to this, in keeping with my strong argument around specificity, specific adaptations to practice for performance in a specific environment. And of course, it depends what kind of scientist you are. If I was a physiologist, a neuroscientist, a medic, a biomechanist, I'd probably want to talk about different aspects of the adaptations that occur in human function as a risk of prolonged engagement. But as a cognitive scientist, I'm going to devote my interest here mostly to the development of game intelligence skill, as I suggested, notably anticipation and decision making. So, sport, high performance sports, baseball, American football, ice hockey, tennis, soccer, they're all played under very rapid spatial temporal constraints. It's a huge amount of information to process, and we have limited time to do so. We cannot actually react to what's happening. We have to learn to anticipate. So how do we do this? Well, the bottom line is that 10 years, 10,000 hours of practice plus leads to cognitive adaptations in long-term working memory that allows us to process information more effectively. Experts are not born with superior eyesight. So when the commentator goes, the athlete's got great vision or a great eye, that isn't true. Okay, what actually the commentator should be saying is the athlete's got great perceptual cognitive skills, but that doesn't sound quite so sexy, I guess. So some of the adaptations that we've picked up, firstly, experts are better at picking up advanced visual cues from the body shape of an opponent, for instance. So this is clearly a baseball pitcher, and experts are able to pick up information from the way the pitcher is shaping up prior to ball release. Not much time there, is there? But in essence, the skilled baseball batter would be much more attuned to the key sources of information. And it may not necessarily be a single cue or source, like from the wrist, for instance. Actually, the evidence suggests that the information is probably distributed across the entire system, such that even if I were to put a filter on this so you can't really see the image very well, a skilled baseball batter would still be able to pick up this motion information. And even if we convert the image of the player into dots of light moving around in the screen, then experts still have that superior ability. So it shows that I can degrade vision quite substantively, actually, before there begins to be a decrement in performance, thus highlighting the fact that vision in and of itself is not the key determining factor in expertise on this task. I'm going to give you a quick test. It's England versus USA in the semi-final, should we say the final, let's be positive, of the World Cup in Qatar next year. As usual, it's gone to a penalty shootout. England. Well, next year it will be men in Qatar, but we can envisage both ways. Don't know when the next Women's World Cup is, but it's not far off. Anyway, you're the goalkeeper, the US goalkeeper. You know England doesn't do well in penalty shootouts. So what your task is to try and anticipate which corner of the screen or the goal the ball will be directed into. Okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 2 penalty kicks, but I'm going to show each one 3 times. First time, it'll be occluded fairly early, before football contact, then at football contact, and then on the third one, I expect you all to be diving to whatever corner of the goal the ball's going to, because you'll see the first push in the ball flight. But the question is, can you pick up the advance information prior to football contact? First penalty, where's it going? 1-0 England. Second penalty. Same penalty, sorry. Third one, third occlusion, that's going to the top left-hand corner of the screen. Next one. Okay, this is coming to this bottom left-hand corner here. But, it illustrates the concept of how experts become much more attuned to those sources of information. Another key finding is that experts are better at recognizing structure in evolving sequences of play. This work actually first started off in the domain of chess. And what they did is they showed chess grandmasters a brief 2-second look at a chessboard and then asked them to turn around and reproduce the chess positions. And they were able to do so with a remarkable degree of accuracy. And the reason for this is when they viewed the board, they grouped together individual chess positions into meaningful patterns and structures. And this same effect has been demonstrated in sport, in soccer, in basketball, in field hockey, in ice hockey, in that if I showed you action footage, those who were familiar with the sport would be linking together individual player positions into these meaningful patterns. So they'd be identifying familiarity and structure, and this would then help them to be able to anticipate what the end outcome of that sequence might be. So it's a pretty resilient and pretty robust finding. Even again, if I was to replace these images of players with dots of light moving around the screen, there'd still be a skill effect, quite a clear expertise factor. So again, 10 years plus of practice has developed a library of patterns of play that makes it possible for people to be able to interpret what will happen before it actually happens. We also know that experts have more effective visual search behaviors. Technology has improved here substantively over the last few decades. A mobile eye tracking system in the top left-hand corner here is not much bigger than a pair of sunglasses. And what you end with, you have a video image of the scene, and then you get a crosshair that represents where a performer is fixating their gaze. And what we know here is that experts fixate on more informative areas of the display for different periods of time and are more distinct and effective visual search behaviors. Sometimes actually in sport, athletes have lots of fixations of short duration. And what the eye tracking system does is it actually monitors what the fovea is doing. So if you look at the word bay there, which is Bayern Munich 6, look at bay. What you've done is you brought that word onto the fovea, and the fovea is responsible for highly detailed and acute vision. Whereas in contrast, keep fixating on bay, and am I moving my right hand up or down or left or right? So what you should be able to do is to use then peripheral vision to pick up motion. So you'd probably have to fixate on it to tell me it was my finger, but unless I told you to start, which I did. But all you see in the periphery is motion. But if you want to know what the detail is, you have to fixate on it. And sometimes experts use the fovea better, sometimes they use peripheral vision better. There's also been work to suggest that experts use the visual system much more efficiently in aiming tasks, like the basketball free throw. So a colleague of mine called Joan Vickers at the University of Calgary came up with what was called the quiet eye phenomenon. And the quiet eye phenomenon is the final fixation on the target prior to the initiation of action. And she first showed it in basketball free throw shooting. So there's the basketball free throw shooter in the bottom left. There's the image of the eye in the top left-hand corner. And then the black square there on the rim is where the free throw shooter is fixating his gaze. And what she found was that elite free throw shooters had a much longer quiet eye than their near elite counterparts. And even when she did a within group comparison, she found that the elite free throw shooters had a longer quiet eye on successful compared to less successful shots. And this quiet eye actually has been subsequently been found in, I would say, probably 60 odd aiming tasks. Snooker, billiards, darts, shooting, even table tennis, archery. It's even been found in other things like arthroscopic surgery, suturing in medicine. And so it's been a very, very robust phenomenon. And one of the grants that I'm working on at the moment, for instance, is looking at how the quiet eye period in shooting in warfighters is impacted by dry and wet, cold environments. So we've got a thermoregulatory chamber. Sorry? Quiet eye. Yep, quiet eye. And we're also recording some EEG data to look at some of the underlying processes here. Another factor is that experts developed a vast library of expectations of what might likely happen in any given situation. So by way of illustration, if I showed you a clip from any sport action, and for instance, the goalkeeper's thrown the ball to the fullback in the top circle there, and I might say to you, look, where's this fullback likely to pass the ball, and what is the likelihood of those occurring? Rank them in order of probability. And what you find here is that experts are a lot more accurate at this task, as determined by what a panel of coaches thought and by what actually happened in the game. So again, experts develop a hierarchy of probabilities given the particular context, the situation, the story in the game, the opponent. This is what's more or less likely to happen in those kinds of situations. We also know that experts show greater robustness under pressure. So this is a study that we did in karate. And what you find under low anxiety is that opponents tend to fixate centrally on the head and chest. They move the eyes up and down on the center line. And what they're doing is they're using peripheral vision, sensitive to motion, to see where the attack is coming from. Right hand, right foot, left foot. But when they become anxious, there's a change in the underlying visual search behaviors. So now what they do is they decrease the amount of time fixating centrally, and now they move the eyes to fixate on the arm fist region. But if you fixate on this finger and fixate on this finger, now rapidly move your gaze from one point to the other, that's what's called a saccadic eye movement. And during that saccadic eye movement, the brain is actually unable to process information, although the brain makes up the gap to some degree through a process of summation. But it is disadvantageous from a time perspective to use the fovea to extract that information. It's much better to fixate centrally and use peripheral vision, because the timing loop in our ability to process that information is a lot shorter. So the key issues, therefore, is that expertise or game intelligence does not arise through genetics. I'm not saying genetic factors don't influence, for instance, the rate at which people respond to practice. That's possible, but certainly experts don't have superior visual systems per se. They develop a vast library in memory that allows them to process information much more efficiently and effectively. So they're better at picking up postural cues, better at using probabilities, better at recognizing patterns and structures, and they use more effective gaze behaviors. And all of these types of skills interact. So this is a study that we did a few years ago in soccer. And what we did is we presented elite and sub-elite soccer players with what we call far and near tasks. So in the far task, the ball was a long way away from them in the other half of the field. In the near task, the ball was a lot closer to them, towards the edge of their penalty area or their goal. And then what we did is we recorded gaze behaviors. So there are clearly skill differences here, but let's focus on the difference between the far task and the near task. So in the far task, the skilled players have lots of fixations of short duration to a large number of fixation locations. So they're trying to make themselves aware of the positions and movements of players off the ball. This could also be a quarterback, I guess, or a pivot in basketball. So wide scanning frequencies. Whereas in the near task, you can see a distinct change. Now there's fewer fixations of longer duration to a much smaller number of fixation locations. Subsequent work suggests that the reason for that, of course, is they're using peripheral vision a lot more. So when the ball's a lot closer to them, they're fixating on the ball and using the periphery to try and pick up relative motion that informs decision making. We also collected think aloud verbal protocols from them and immediately post. So we asked them to verbalize what information they were using, put simply. And what we found here is that when the ball's a long way away, they're much more likely to be trying to recognize patterns and structures. Whereas when the ball's a lot closer to them, they're much more likely to be able to pick up postural cues or probabilistic information. We've even done some interesting work with Wimbledon tennis players. We had access to Queen's Club in Wimbledon, where we got to video some of the top 10 tennis players in the world. And we actually converted the video images into animations of different rallies. So this is Queen's Club on the left. This on the right is a computer animation of the rally that was played on the left. So all that we ended up with was two cylinders moving around on the screen and the ball. And believe it or not, the skilled players were still able to successfully anticipate where the opponent was going to strike the ball, even when they were not able to see any of their posture or the opponent's racket. So you can see the higher level cognitive information that's being used here. Things like the player's relative positioning on the court. Where are they relative to the net and the angles involved. Wide range of information used here. And in another study, actually, what we did is we showed video clips of a final shot in the rally. And in one condition, it was just a one-shot rally. In another condition, it was a four-shot rally. And in another condition, it was a six-shot rally. And what we tried to identify, does it help if you're able to see all the preceding shots in the rally? In other words, is that information cumulative in helping you come to a decision? And on these data sets, it was. So therefore, what it shows is that experts are able to pick up this systematic information over a prolonged number of trials. However, I tell a little bit of a white lie here, to be honest, because when we then look more carefully at the data, on some trials, there was no effect. So in other words, the information was not cumulative at all. On other shots, we actually got a negative effect of showing all the rallies. And the reason for this is that what happened was the information became incongruent. So in other words, you're picking up visual information from the postural shape of the opponent at the same time as you're making probabilistic judgments about, given what I know about this opponent, given what the score is, given the stage of the game, what's more likely to happen. And when those two sources of information align, then anticipation is significantly enhanced. But when they're incongruent, there's a mismatch. And then we get deception, and we get significantly reduced performance. So some interesting parallels here in domains like law enforcement, military, medicine, and aviation. We've done a study, for instance, in an emergency room medical situation, where in one study, the emergency room medics had case notes. In another condition, they had no case notes. And in the third condition, they had inaccurate case notes. All of which are scenarios which could conceivably happen in an emergency room situation. And then we tried to look as to how experts dealt with those situations compared to less expert performers. It's interesting in a law enforcement or a military situation in that usually there are briefing notes on a forthcoming battle. There are tactics and strategies determined. So there's a plan of action. And of course, if the evolving battle information aligns with that plan of action, yeah, you get better, superior decision making. But if they don't align, then you could get incongruence and you could get deception and increased period of time. Okay, last 5 or 10 minutes, I'm just going to talk a little bit. So what I've done there is highlighted some of the adaptations that occur through practice. What I've really done is highlighted how unique the human brain is in terms of its considerable plasticity and adaptability. Whilst, of course, some of these strategies and processes probably apply across a range of different domains, most of the evidence suggests that the specific knowledge is specific to the domain. And although, of course, the closer two domains of expertise become, the more likely there is that there is transfer. So, for instance, there's some evidence to suggest that there is transfer of pattern recognition skills from soccer to field hockey because they're quite similar sports strategically, but not from volleyball to soccer because they're very different. But I said there hasn't really been enough evidence to explore the concept of transfer. So in this final section, I'm just going to talk a little bit about learning. Because, of course, not every hour of practice has equal value, and some hours are better than others. And this is a typical model of instruction, whatever your professional domain, whether it's sport or medicine or military. And what we do as instructors is we convey information, we structure practice, we provide feedback. And often we convey information through demonstrations, verbal instructions. We then decide how we're going to practice the skill. And then we vary feedback in terms of its precision, frequency, and mode. And perhaps underpinning it all is our mode of instruction and the extent to which we might be prescriptive, hands-on, or a little bit more hands-off in the instruction process. So the first issue to note here, and one of the single biggest problems for anybody involved in the instruction process, is the differentiation between performance and learning. So if I take a group of 14 12-year-old girls and are coaching basketball to them, then what I see in that session is not their learning, but their performance. Okay? In order to infer that learning has taken place, I have to see that that change in performance is retained over time into subsequent practice sessions, and that it also transfers from that practice session to other practice sessions and to performance. Okay, and the reason why the differentiation between performance and learning is crucial is we have another reversal phenomenon here, or an apparent paradox. So, if I want best performance during practice in the short term, then the evidence is quite clear. Demonstrate a lot, provide lots of instruction, do specific blocked practice of a single skill, and provide feedback often and detailed. But rather ironically, the reverse applies for learning. So the evidence now becomes much clearer that for learning, the question should be, well, what's the least amount of information that I need to give this learner so they can begin to practice the task? To what extent is the practice environment specific to the performance conditions, realistic, challenging, technically, tactically, physically, emotionally, psychologically? Okay, specificity. Specificity of practice leads to specific adaptations for the development of expertise. And, what is the least amount of feedback do I need to give the performer so that the performer can begin to learn independently? These do not produce immediate short-term performance, but produce better long-term gain. That's an interesting dilemma. So the big challenge for anybody involved in instruction is you cannot see learning. So what you see is not what you get. You can have a great session, great practice session, you think, wow, that's a great session. Really? We don't know. Whereas you could have a session that is quite chaotic and there's an element of randomness to it, which you think that's not a good session, but maybe they're learning a lot from it. And of course, the ultimate performance environment is chaotic and random. The other thing that's become of late as well is the importance of deliberate practice. So deliberate practice is specific, purposeful practice with the intention of improving some aspect of performance. And my colleague Anders Ericsson, again from Florida State University, put forward this graph. And what he argued is that when we learn skills, we go through 3 stages of development, each of which are increasingly more automatic or autonomous: a cognitive stage, an associative stage, an autonomous stage. And that, like learning to drive, for instance, in the sense that when we all learn to drive, then we have to concentrate on looking in the mirror, changing gear, changing clutch, maybe not so much in the US, but certainly in the UK, indicating at the right time, taking our right position on the road, all of which, of course, take cognitive resources. But then as we pass our driving test, and we've been driving a couple of years, then more and more of these aspects become automated. However, what we then do is that most of us settle for what's called arrested development then. So, none of us want to be Grand Prix drivers. None of us want to, cut 30 seconds off our journey time from home to work every day. So we become established at that level. And what he argues actually is experts don't. Experts strive to avoid this arrested development by engaging in what he referred to as deliberate practice. So this is a classical learning curve. We've got performance on the vertical axis, deliberate practice along the bottom. So we're all somewhere on this learning curve, whatever the task might be. But wherever we're at the learning curve, what we therefore need to do is to identify what specific aspects of performance that we need to work on to improve. And where possible, that needs to be empirically driven. It's a real challenge for coaches, though, isn't it? Because I might have 16 kids in my group, and they're all individual. They're all at different places in that learning curve. So the argument is practice that would take you from that last but one circle to the top one is what you might call growth training. Whereas practice that merely maintains you at the current level may be referred to as maintenance training. So what do we know? We know that experts practice differently to less experts. We know that experts devote more time to practice their weaker skills, whereas less experts spend more time practicing the skills they're already good at. So we can see the experts are in this growth mindset. Experts invest more mental and physical effort in the task, are more likely to engage in self-reflection before, during, and after practice, and sometimes they do find practice less enjoyable. That may have been partly the fact that some of this practice was heavy technical practice. It may also have been partly a reflection of the fact that what happens when you engage in challenging practice is you fail a lot more. Okay, so the importance of setting what are called challenge points and desirable difficulties are therefore important. So every session needs to be pitched to the right level such that you're challenging the system to grow. Okay, so it can't be too easy, it can't be too hard. So given the differentiation between performance and learning and the individual aspect of learning, it's a really, really challenging situation to be in any instructional capacity, and perhaps particularly coaching. And I often wonder whether some of these psychological factors come into it, okay, the so-called things that we can't see underneath the sea level. So psychological characteristics like achievement motivation, mental toughness, perfectionism, resilience, coping, grit. We all know that experts score higher on these kinds of measures. They're much more used to dealing with rocky roads, bumpy roads. The interesting question, of course, is that did they join that sport per se with these psychological characteristics, or were these psychological characteristics nurtured and developed in the learning environment? And again, we have no longitudinal research at the moment, to my knowledge, that tracks these psychological characteristics and how they may develop over time. The final frontier, of course, is technology. And there's been a huge growth in technology at different times. Use of virtual reality is now prevalent. Sleep pods. Do you actually know that we actually learn when we're sleeping through the process of consolidation and not during practice? So a lot of elite teams now have sleep pods where people can have a little nap for 10 minutes in between practice sessions. And the evidence suggests that it's beneficial for skill development. So there's a whole range of body sensors, trackers, EEG measures, designs and equipment that all are clearly making a crucial factor in the development of expertise. So I guess in conclusion, to become expert, it does help if you're born lucky. Secondly, it's adaptations to practice that are important. I do not dismiss the fact that there may be a nature versus nurture debate in this. But what I'm pretty clear about is that no one becomes an expert without a huge investment in practice over a prolonged period of time. There are no shortcuts. It's practice, practice, practice. And of course, the benefits of optimizing return on practice. Maybe the key issue is practicing efficiently. And the interesting question is, for every hour of practice, how much of that might actually transfer to an improvement in performance? And if we could measure that, I probably wouldn't need to do this talk. There's probably a lot of money in it, but we can't measure it. But I suspect if we could, we'd be quite disappointed. It may be as low as 10, 20%. So what might be a good return? Should there be a 30, 40, 50% return on every hour of practice? How do we get there? How do we structure practice? How do we develop environments that optimize that? So clearly for me, the system needs to be on effective models and systems of developing talent. So it is mostly about culture and environment. And as I said to you, I just flew back from Austria and yesterday, and two quotes struck me actually as being philosophically supporting much of my argument. At the Red Bull High Performance Center in Salzburg, as you walk through the door, they have the phrase, hard work beats talent if talent doesn't work hard. And then in a newspaper article where they'd interviewed a famous British and Irish Lion rugby player, Irish player Paul O'Connell, he said that the key focus when they were doing well as a team was they decided that they would be the very best at everything that did not involve talent. And I thought that was quite an interesting statement as well, actually. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention.
So we have time for a few questions. Be sure to wait for the microphone.
Hello, great talk. Quick question. Natural talent. You hear this about young kids that are just exceptional fairly early on. Where do you see that fitting in? I know this is the nature-nurture side of your talk, which you sort of, but there's clearly some kids that are just really good out of the get-go. Do you think they just have a steeper curve at the beginning of their practice, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's very little longitudinal research, and also in principle, I guess, if the two of us start a sport at the same time and we each invest 1,000 hours in it, is there any evidence to suggest that you'd learn better than I? We don't know. And what might potentially be genetic factors that may determine what changes and modifies that rate of learning, we really don't know. And of course, talent development is not linear either. I mean, all of these factors, not just technical, tactical, but physical, psychological, they're non-linear in development. So they oscillate a great deal over time. And there are lots of athletes who seem quite precocious early on, who just don't develop. And there are others who don't seem like great athletes, but eventually develop along the way. And I guess it's an interesting question. And I come back to the question that I posed on the podium. If I'm in charge of an academy, and I've got space for 100 kids, and there are 1,000 kids want to get in that academy, how do I select which 100? It's just one of those, isn't it? Serendipity. No? You have the solution?
I don't have a solution.
Okay.
I don't particularly have a solution except for the fact that my interest is in basketball, youth basketball. And as you work camps and you work around children, you're able to intuitively pick out better ball players than others at that particular age of the development, and so it's easier. But just because of your expertise, I mean, you see a kid shoot, you know they've got terrible form or they've got good form, and I would suggest that it's a crapshoot at times. But if you have 100 and you pick out 80, you're going to find a pretty good team out of those 80.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Thing is, you can't always observe latent potential. So, and kids don't develop at the same rate. Actually, there isn't a huge amount of research on what criteria coaches use in making those judgments. There are a few quite neat studies, actually, and one used video footage, and it was actually in ice hockey, if I remember rightly. And they had something like 15 scouts that viewed the footage and were then asked to select which players that they would choose from these video clips to notionally join this fictional training academy. And there was hardly any correlation between them. And let me give you another example of the subjective nature of it as well. One of the things they did in Free University in Amsterdam have a very nice project with Ajax soccer team. And what they did is they had scouts select which players that they were going to choose from, I think it was an under-10s group, for their training academy. And in one condition, the number on the shirt was just a number, shirt number, okay? In another condition, they put the month of birth on the child on the back of the shirt. Okay, so if you were September month 1, October month 2, and the selections were totally different. So just the fact of alerting kids to the age of these players had a significant impact on how they selected players. The one thing I do know that's important, because people ask me, what do you choose? I don't know. The only thing I know, it's a long journey, okay? And, by the time players get to the Premier League, it's 20,000 hours of practice, okay? If you don't have the passion, the interest, the motivation, the grit, the resilience, the perfectionist strivings, no matter how good your genes are, no matter how good an athlete you are, you've got no chance. Maybe we should select on those characteristics. Don't know.
And that
May still not be enough, of course. I'm not saying that. But if you haven't got those, you've got nowhere to start.
One more question.
And that led me to a question about burnout. How do you psychologically stay off burnout?
Yeah, I mean that. Can I be clear that actually on the soccer data, what they're doing is they're not actually specializing. What they're doing is what we've termed early engagement. So they are participating mostly in soccer, but they are participating in other sports, although it's quite small. But it's their choice. They're not constrained into it. Skiing is very similar to soccer in terms of pathway, actually. It's early engagement, but they do diversify a lot. I mean, the potential problems with early specialization are the risks of burnout and overuse injuries. And clearly there have been some documented cases of those, there's no doubt about it. So, I mean, burnout can to some degree avoided, of course, if you've got a positive learning environment and there's a lot of variety in terms of the nature of the coaching and the instruction. And that would probably also help in terms of avoiding injuries. But yeah, it's a difficult balance, isn't it? And you know what? There's no clear answer to it. In the chapter in the book on the debate between specialization and diversification, we end it with, it depends which is better, because it's very sport specific. And also there's a moral aspect to this, right? So let me put it this way. I mean, would I want my kids to join a soccer academy at 6 years of age? No. Okay? Because it's too much pressure, huge development. 0.01% of them are offered a professional contract, and it's a long journey. So for my own kids, I'd say, well, I'd like them to engage in whatever sports they want to participate in, broad engagement, and enjoy sport, because not many of us get to be professional athletes, and then we have a lifetime of skills that we can service well in terms of physical activity, all right? But, put my different hat on, I'm an academy director, okay? I might get one of these players through, and it's worth $100 million to the club. Okay? And I think, well, if we get them in early, we put them through the right training programs, all the adaptations occur, we avoid this practice deficit. So I've also done some work for US soccer, Australian soccer. Let me give you a cultural significant difference. In the UK, Europe, North America, soccer is king. Okay, it's a huge part of the culture. You go to the UK, get a British newspaper, 6 pages of sports, 5 3/4 pages are on soccer. Okay, it's just obsessive. The parents are obsessive. It's almost like religion. So soccer is absolutely huge. So kids engage early. By age 9, these kids have accumulated, as I said, 4,000 hours of practice. Okay. In the US, Australia, soccer not quite so popular. It's a multicultural sports society. Okay, sports are seasonal. There's lots more options. Elite American soccer players typically accumulate far less hours in practice than their European counterparts. And I think probably that's a factor. So plus points is they get the diversity of sporting engagement. Downside, of course, is that when they get to age 9, so they've got 2,000 hours of practice, and they're coming up against players with 4,000 hours of practice. That's not fair either at one level. So, it depends.
Okay, I renege. One more question and one more short answer.
Okay.
So we talked about the 10,000 hours of practice here.
Sorry.
But you also talked about the pressure factor, which is an emotional factor, right?
Yeah.
Which can strike anytime. So is there any practice for like emotions or pressure point of view? Because like all the 10,000 are mostly, like the practice is mostly physical, right? And what about emotions that comes in?
Well, I think that this, at one level, this is where the specificity of practice comes in again. This is why it's important that practice learning environments are infused with pressure and stress in various ways, because when you're learning, whether you're a warfighter or a baseball player, in essence, you need to be able to cope with those pressures. And the more you can experience those and try new strategies and adapt to those, then the better you'll be able to cope with those environments. Clearly, there has been, in the sport domain, there has been increasing emphasis on the use of sports psychologists. So most of the top organizations now have sports psychologists who will help develop some of these strategies around emotional control. And knowing what changes, for instance, knowing that the quiet eye shortens when we get anxious, knowing that our gaze behaviors change when we become anxious, I think also helps as a potential of using that as a source of biofeedback. As a final point, then coming back to this question of specificity, so we know there's a lot of work that shows anxiety impacts performance. There's quite a bit of work on physiological workload, mental fatigue, but typically the experimental work has only manipulated one of those stressors. Now think about it now, I'm in combat, okay? I'm probably haven't slept for days, probably haven't eaten for days, I'm cold, I'm anxious for my life, I'm probably fatigued, mentally and physically. So all of those different stressors interact. So a couple of questions would be, well, how do we cope with all those different stressors? And how do we prioritize where to allocate attention? And then secondly, well, how do we develop environments that help people to cope with those stressors and or develop psychological skills that may also better support them in those kinds of environments? This is why, I guess from a sport perspective, actually, one of the positives relative to warfare, if you pardon the pun, is that failure is generally a good thing in sport because you can learn from that. It's an opportunity to learn and you can try things differently. So having the growth mindset and being able to deal with that is an important aspect of it. No, I'm going to try this, do this different. The problem in a military combat, of course, you might only be able to fail once. And that makes the challenges of creating real-world learning environments in warfare a lot more difficult than it is in sport.
On that note, let's thank our speaker.